Our next speaker, I know, has been eagerly waited on by many of you here. She's a well-known clinical psychologist, and my recollection of her previous life was a sex therapist. And I used to giggle like a little boy when I used to read some of her stuff, and probably a little bolder now, but and now she's sort of reinvented herself into a, I don't know if that's fair to say reinvent, but she says she is keen to end the demonisation of men. Perhaps another way to describe that is she's against the feminist movement turning into sort of an anti-men movement. One thing she's also responsible for is having a conversation with the hotel yesterday where they were seriously considering shutting down this event because protesters had made it known that they were considering coming along to protest Bettina.
Made it, Andrew.
Yeah, so that was an interesting conversation, and just shows you just how ridiculous society has got when someone with what I would consider very mainstream thoughts is constantly under attack wherever she goes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bettina Ardnt.
Thank you. I hope you're not all boiling. I think we've got the air conditioning working now. It's getting very hot here. Thank you, Andrew. Lovely to be here. And I think between the time I first talked to Andrew and now, I've launched my whole new career as a speaker on university campuses talking about the rape crisis. So you had no idea what you were getting yourself into when I first volunteered to speak today. So it's a very exciting time for me, and I want to tell you about what I'm doing, speaking on campuses, and why. And I suppose the best example to me of that was last year. I spent 8 months helping a guy, a PhD student at Adelaide, deal with an approach that had been made to him from a university committee which was investigating a sexual assault charge against him. And he contacted me and told me about this, and I got a criminal barrister to help him negotiate with this committee. When they first contacted me, I had no idea what they were talking about, no idea what this complaint was all about. And it was really clear from my very first contact with him that the university committee had no idea what they were doing, barging into what could be a criminal sexual assault matter. The barrister was advising him to not go near this committee, that they had no authority whatsoever to start investigating this sort of case, and to demand full details of the accusation. And it took us most of 8 months to get that from the university. What was really scary for him is this committee had the right to withhold his PhD. So it's something he had to take very seriously. I got involved in writing to the university. We had various other people writing. He was writing these letters, legal letters. And then all of a sudden, the university's general counsel charged in and wrote to him and said, oh, no, it's all right, we're going to protect your due process rights, we're going to make sure you're going to have procedural fairness, you don't have to appear before the committee, we'll get you full details of the accusation. And she obviously realised the university was getting into deep shit in terms of their legal position. And so the whole thing started to change a bit. Now, what was interesting when he got the full details of the accusations is how his version of events differed enormously from hers. The girl concerned claimed that he'd been pursuing her all the way through, and that he'd invited her over on the night in question. He actually had kept the social media evidence to show this wasn't the case. I made a YouTube video about this. Every young man here, particularly if you're university students, should have a look at that video. It's very scary. And we've put up some of those social media messages between them. And his story is that, that he was getting involved. They never had intercourse. There was a bit of sex play going on. And all of a sudden she said she didn't want to go any further because she'd fallen in love with someone else. And he said he stopped, got dressed, left, went home, cut off all contact with her, defriended her on Facebook and so on. And that appears that's what really annoyed her. We don't really know, because all of a sudden the next thing he knew was this sexual assault charge. So eventually the university backed down. They announced that they weren't proceeding with this case. He was given his PhD and with great relief left the university. Now, why did he come to me? Well, this has been my territory for over 40 years. As you know, heard, for some of you too young to know about my lurid early past. I mean, I find it very weird to be called a conservative bigot by students on campus, because I spent my whole early career being accused of being some sort of sex fiend. I was banned from live television and radio for 2 years for talking about sex. I had quite a different reputation in the early days. And I really was one of Australia's first sex therapists, and became the person that everybody talked to about sex, which is pretty weird for a 23-year-old. I taught medical students and professionals all around Australia, and we published this little adult sex education magazine. We were one of the first people in Australia to publish articles about really important issues like sexual violence, marital rape, and so on. I was very much a feminist. But I've always been interested in hearing both sides of the story and helping men and women get on better with each other, rather than promoting discord between the sexes. And over the past 20 years, I've done a big shift in that I've become increasingly concerned about men's issues, worried about a whole range of areas where laws, rules and regulations are being tilted to unfairly advantage women at the expense of men. And I'm going to talk tomorrow a little bit more about how that happened and why I no longer call myself a feminist. But I decided very deliberately to take on this particular issue of the campus rape crisis, because this whole manufactured rape crisis seems a very good way to highlight what's going on here, particularly in terms of broader issues as well. So I decided to contact students groups around Australia and ask if some of them would sponsor me and give me the opportunity to talk about why our universities are pretending that our campuses are unsafe for young women. Now, I think Matthew talked a little bit about what's happened so far. It all started at La Trobe with the first group to sponsor me, and in mid-August I was first told that I could speak there, and then they suddenly turned around. This is what's interesting to me. The administration, I think, made a decision on their own to suddenly announce, no, I was banned because my talk didn't align with the values of the university. Isn't that extraordinary? The values of the university being to lie about the safety of our campus. And that they were promoting this campaign about sexual violence on campus, and I was going to be challenging that, which indeed I was. And so what happened is I went to the media, the university backed down. Then I had a funny phone call with someone from admin, and one of the things he said to me is, we might have to get counselling for the people who attend your court talk. But then they said we were going to be charged for extra security. Of course, this is the big tactic, as you've heard. And then eventually they backed down on that. So they agreed to waive the security fee, and my talk went ahead. It was pretty interesting. On the day I went in and talked to the protesters and said, I'd like you to come and have a discussion with me. I'm very happy to answer questions. And they stood there with this megaphone like 2 feet from me, screaming at me. And then they did their best to disrupt the whole talk. Interestingly, this extra security, we had these security guards there who stayed on the inside of the venue. I mean, these protesters are bashing on this glass door all the way through the talk, and using megaphones to make an enormous din. And here are these security guards inside the venue doing nothing to control the noise, and did nothing to really protect the other people who attended the talk. That's what interested me, that for me, it was like some spy movie. They hustled me off into a car and then they took me to another car. I mean, they really looked after me very well, but they made the poor protesters leave the venue, walk out through this group of really hostile demonstrators, which I thought was pretty tough. Anyway, so, but essentially La Trobe was nothing compared to Sydney Uni. both universities actually had demonstrations prior to the event, objecting and saying I wasn't allowed to speak on campus. But at Sydney, it was a really extraordinary experience. They managed to totally block off, demonstrators managed to totally block off the access to the venue, this corridor, which allowed people to access the venue. Most of my audience was stuck outside that. They were extremely aggressive, pushing and shoving people, shoving them against the wall, blocking any possibility of most of them getting through, hurling lovely abusive stuff at me. I think it's really interesting that these feminists are abusing an older woman, and not only that, one of them on her Facebook page called me a reptilian scum. Surely some lawyer here can help me with a case before the Human Rights Commission, because that's certainly an ageist insult as far as I'm but it was actually pretty scary. I've got a whole lot of people who were there trying to get through to my audience, who've given me witness statements about how threatened they felt and how much they were abused. So what's happened is I've put in and also Sydney charged my students, my Liberal Club students who hosted the event, $470 something for security. And we went through this email exchange where I said to the university, what are we paying for? I want to know what you are instructing the security to do. Are they to have any role in stopping people from closing down the event? And we got no answer to any of that. So what we've done is we put in an application to see if, to ask whether we could have the security. So I go back. So what happened is in the end, the security guards were unable to control this mob and made the decision to call in the riot police. We had like 20, 30 riot police, which cleaned out the protesters and allowed my audience to get through. So in my view, the security failed to do their job, and they were incapable of doing the job. It's very interesting talking to the security guards because they said, we're toothless tigers. The students know perfectly well that we can't do anything against them, and they walk all over us until the police come in. Anyway, so with the Liberal Club students and I put in a letter to Vice-Chancellor saying that we wanted the security charge refunded because they had been unable to do anything to allow the event to go ahead. It was only the police who did that. They've just come back and said no, they're not going to refund that. They said that the security guards fulfilled their protocol, and therefore there was no problem. And of course, this is the question. I could never get an answer what the security guards were required to do. And just this morning, I've got a response to my bigger complaint. I put in a formal complaint to the university naming 5 key organisers of the protest, people who absolutely took ownership of the event, who boasted on video that they were going to the student magazine, for instance, boasted that they had said, we're going to stop her speaking on campus. And on the night they were there with the megaphones, they were leading the chants, so there were key people we easily identified. We had video footage of all of that, and I put that all into the university, naming them, giving the evidence as to their the fact that they organised this protest, and asked for formal complaints to be made against them under the university's code of conduct, which prevents students from stopping other students accessing facilities and education on the university, and their bullying and harassment policies, which require people to treat each other decently, and require the students to treat members of the public with respect and courtesy and so on. So there are a whole range of breaches, and clearly these students in particular were responsible for breaches to those regulations. Now, as I was saying, just this morning I got a response from the university who are, in theory, investigating, and they're asking for me to provide witnesses so that they can follow through and present the evidence to the people I've named. So at least something is happening. We will see where it all goes. So that's where we are so far, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. But my goal on this campus tour I want to just tell you a bit more about what that's really all about. And that brings me back to that Adelaide case. What's the university doing getting involved in trying a rape cases? These unqualified people blundering around and possibly risking any chance of a fair trial, both for the accuser and for the accused when it comes to a possible criminal matter. And the answer is really simple. That committee is the end goal. That's the aim of all those protests. That's the reason the feminist activists are trying to shut me down. And that's the reason that universities are trying to silence me, including the Latrobe administration. There's a real campaign going on trying to get universities involved in trying rape cases. And it's essentially about the fact that feminists are really unhappy because in date rape, he said, she said sort of cases, often involving people who've been going out together or people who know each other, it's really rare that you get a conviction if you go before a jury. Because juries are not going to send young men to jail for 7 years if they don't know who to believe. It's just her evidence against his. And the feminist activists are convinced this is a terrible state of affairs, and they think we should just forget it. With these date rape cases, we should forget about the criminal justice system and get the universities involved, as happened in America. So in a university setting, they can use lower standards of proof and get more rape convictions. And that's exactly what happened. 7 years ago in America, Obama required all publicly funded universities to set up tribunals where, using lower standards of proof, these tribunals would investigate and make decisions around sexual assault and harassment. And some of the cases are just extraordinary. If you want to read about this, there's a really good book called The Campus Rape Frenzy. And that was published a few years ago, but was tracking a lot of the cases where young men, particularly, sometimes it's a young woman, it's usually a young man, have been thrown out of university as a result of this sort of accusation of sexual assault. And they are real kangaroo courts. Often the people concerned are not given details of the accusation, they're not allowed access to a lawyer, they're not allowed to cross-examine the person who's making the accusations against them, they're often not allowed access to social media evidence. There's examples of people who've been locked up, young men who've been locked up for days on their own, with no access to anybody by some sort of university committee. And it's led to endless federal court lawsuits against the universities. And that book, Campus Rape Frenzy, when that came out, they had all the figures up to then, which showed at that point 53 cases out of 37 the universities had lost. And there were huge numbers more in the pipeline. Some of it is just such crazy stuff. As I said, sometimes the accused can be a woman, and I was reading this fascinating University of Cincinnati case where a young guy and a girl are in bed together, they're sort of drunken hook up, and he wakes up the next day and realises, oh my God, she's going to accuse me of sexual assault. And so he rushes off and beats her to it, rushes off to the complaints unit, and she was suspended from the college, which is pretty rare. Now what's happened is Trump administration is determined to wind back some of this stuff. And just only a few weeks ago, their proposed changes were leaked to the New York Times, of course, and who published what they were proposing to do. And it's all about trying to ensure proper legal rights for the accused. And there's been surveys published just in the last few weeks showing most Americans surveyed believe this is really necessary. They think there's something very unfair being going on in this university system. There have been editorials around the country supporting these changes. Now, some of you may know, but the classic case is the Columbia mattress girl. Do you know about her? Fascinating story. Columbia is very interesting to me because my son went there. 2015, Emma Salkovich, her name was. If you Google Columbia mattress girl, you'll read all about her. She's really famous. She became a global celebrity because she carried her mattress around Columbia University for 3 years, claiming that the university had failed to follow through on her accusation she was actually accusing a guy of anally raping and choking her. he was a young German student called Paul Nussgesser. And she felt that the university was wrong in deciding not to take action against her. The university had actually investigated the case and found him not guilty. So if you look at the social media message between the two, 2 days after the alleged rape, she was contacting him saying that she wanted to join a party in his room. A month later, she was saying to him, "I want to see you." 2 months later, she said, "I love you, Paul, where are you?" So the university decided he wasn't guilty, and yet they allowed this young woman to carry her mattress around campus for 3 years, holding protests where she openly named Nussgesser as her rapist. And they, just mind-boggling, she was doing a visual arts degree, and they gave her credit for her visual arts degree for this performance art, and they allowed her to take her mattress to the graduation ceremony. And Nussgesser has now won his case. He and his family sued the university, and they paid out apparently big time in a confidential settlement for failing to protect him from defamation and harassment. Now, the hilarious thing for me is a week after that Columbia case was settled, we had a protest here in Australia, which was outside Parliament House, and lots of alleged rape victims were carrying their mattresses. And the protest was all about the announcement of the Human Rights Commission survey, which was that was 2017, August the 1st, my birthday. I spent obsessed by trolling through this exciting data. The Human Rights Commission had been charged with their goal was to try to prove there was a rape crisis on our campuses. And they spent $1 million trying to do that. And they came up with virtually nothing. What they found was 0.8% of students reported being sexually assaulted per year. 1.6% over the 2-year study. They didn't even publish the 1-year figure because they said it was too small to report. But think about that. That's 0.8% of students self-selected to fill out a survey. They sent it out to 300,000 people, 30,000 responded, and you would assume that would include, you would assume that would attract people who had an issue, had felt that they had an experience of sexual assault. And so it's only 0.8% of it to any sort of sexual assault whatsoever. That includes things like, that definition includes being tricked into sex against your will, or a stranger touching you on the way to uni or on a train or a bus. It was the broadest possible definition. And I wrote an article in the Australian, which was the only article in mainstream journalism that day to say we should celebrate the fact that we've got really safe campuses. And and that caused the sky to fall in. I love the article in The Guardian where they talked about the fact that, they quoted that Madeleine Albright quote about, the special place in hell for women who don't help other women. They were so outraged that I would dare to suggest this meant there was no problem. I think most people will regard a 99% safety rate. We're talking about 99.2% of women had no experience whatsoever with any sort of sexual assault. And most people regard that as really good news. I was trying to think of what else has a 99% safety rate. And I was thinking back to when I was a young woman, I was the first generation of women, as a single woman, to have access to the pill. And we thought that was fantastic. I mean, this had a 99% safety rate, the pill, preventing unwanted pregnancy. And we just thought, hallelujah. Because this meant the risks were so small, and the risks are so small of getting raped on campus. Now, of course, I'm clearly saying, and every time I speak about this, I say any rape is one too many. I think it's really important to acknowledge that rape is rightly a criminal offence and should be treated very seriously. And I think it's fantastic that everything possible is being done to minimise the trauma for a woman who is wanting to report an alleged sexual assault and give her every chance of a fair hearing. And that's exactly what's happening. I was looking at the statistics in New South Wales the other day, and interesting, if you go back to 1997, the number of rape convictions since then has doubled. 50% of people convicted of sexual assault end up in jail, compared to 10% for other crimes. So this is a crime that is taken very seriously, as it should. But I think there's a real risk that we will diminish the chances of convictions if we cry rape when we're in situations where most juries are not going to believe they're serious enough to convict young men and send them to jail. That 0.8% included 40% of women who said they weren't, what had happened to them wasn't serious enough to report, and 40% said they didn't need help. So clearly within that definition are many women who don't really regard what happened to them as rape. Now what the Human Rights Commission actually found was a lot of unwanted staring, a lot of low-grade sexual harassment, sexual jokes, comments, but mainly staring. And here too, most of the women didn't think it was serious enough to want to do anything about it. Now this was an enormous blow for the activists who'd spent years trying to promote this idea of a rape crisis on our campuses. There'd been screenings across Australia. Almost every university in Australia has shown this movie called The Hunting Ground. Have many of you have seen that? Yep. I mean, it was, it's amazing how widespread the promotion of that movie actually turned out to be. That is a propaganda movie, a movie that was deliberately designed to beat up this idea that campuses are unsafe. An American movie. The filmmakers themselves admitted they had no intention of giving both sides of the discussion. That it was a movie they said was designed to promote this idea that there was a real problem on our campuses. They featured a few key rape cases, and one of them, 11 Harvard law professors, have spoken out and said the movie was biased propaganda for distorting the cases that were featured in the movie, and particularly in the case of one young man who was ultimately exonerated by grand jury. So we have this movie that is full of false statistics, full of misleading information, being shown on virtually every campus in Australia. Michael Spence, the Vice Chancellor at Sydney University, was on a committee promoting the hunting ground around Australia, which I think says a lot. So it's not surprising then that even after the Human Rights Commission data was released, everyone still pretended the rape crisis existed. And I wrote to all our major vice chancellors at our major universities, drawing attention to the evidence. I actually had data from the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics, which showed that universities are 100 times safer than the rest of the community for young women. And it's what you'd expect, isn't it? I mean, if we're comparing it, for instance, to Indigenous communities, the idea is that our universities are much more dangerous than some of the rougher areas of Australia. It's just madness. Anyway, I wrote to all the vice chancellors, presented them with all this data, and asked them why our cash-strapped universities are willing to put off overseas students, full fee-paying students, or families of people in Asia, and from sending their precious daughters to study in Australia. Why are they willing to risk the reputations of our university? It's totally hilarious. I got all these, I could just imagine all the people running around in the media units of the various universities trying to think of weasel words to send back to me. I mean, just total rubbish about, safety is paramount, not addressing the points I made at all. And we had Vice Chancellor after Vice Chancellor going on into the press saying, we're setting up 24-hour rape helplines, we're setting up sexual assault units, we're having compulsory sexual consent courses. They still felt they had to kowtow to this tiny minority group of activists and lie about the safety of our campuses. And I keep saying to everybody, it's a classic Emperor's New Clothes. All those Vice Chancellors are totally naked, and no one dares point out that they're not wearing any clothes. And it's just extraordinary. So that's what I'm doing. My goal is to get out there and expose what's going on and tell people why. And we know where this is going. These universities know perfectly well what's happened in America. They've watched, I'm sure every time they go to an international conference, they learn about the fact that American colleges are on their knees coping with the costs, the massive costs of this tribunal system, let alone the law cases they're losing after the event. But also in Britain, the fascinating things that are happening in Britain. Last year saw the collapse of a whole lot of key rape cases when they discovered there was deliberate withholding of key evidence by prosecutors and police. So feminists have long argued that the social media messages, the sort of thing I mentioned in the Adelaide case, which are often what allows an accused to prove his innocence, the feminists are arguing that should be withheld from rape cases. And that's what they were doing in Britain. So they didn't allow the accused or the accused lawyers access to that information. And that suddenly came out, and a whole lot of major rape cases collapsed when it was discovered that that's what the prosecutors were doing. They were tilting the law in order to get more rape convictions. And the Director of Public Prosecutions had to step down, and all serious rape, sexual assault cases are currently being reviewed in Britain. And the Metropolitan Police, this is what I love, Metropolitan Police have announced they're ditching the practice of believing all victims, which of course, believing all victims is part of the feminist push for victim-centred justice. I don't know how many of you watched the 7:30 report last night, report into what's happening to Paul Kavanagh in America. And it was a classic believe all victims report. They actually quoted women saying, oh, well, we have to believe the victims here. It was such a classic ABC report on this issue. Anyway, so the goal I am exposing is the fact that our universities are being pressured into taking on this job of victim-centred justice because they think that's where they can get more rape convictions. But there are other aspects of this. I mean, for instance, the New South Wales Law Reform Commission has been asked just recently to look into the issue of enthusiastic consent. They sometimes call this the yes means less yes laws. This idea that it's not enough, that there's real problems with the traditional legal definitions around consent, and what we need is enthusiastic consent where usually the man, the person who's instigating sex, has to get enthusiastic yes every inch of the way. Can I kiss you? Can I touch your breast? Can I keep touching your breast? And unless you get yes every inch of the way, you can be accused of rape. And the New South Wales Law Reform Commission is having to investigate that possibility at the moment. But that notion is being taught on campuses around Australia. We have sexual consent courses being run, which are absolutely promoting that idea that we have to change the way we have sex. I mean, what's extraordinary about this is that means most of us are having illegal sex most of the time. I mean, how many of us ask every time, if I have a lovely erection lying next to me in bed, I think nothing of taking advantage of it occasionally. But as my partner points out to me, that is totally illegal. If you get a chance, I made a video around the sexual consent courses that are being used to indoctrinate students. They're really worrying because they put all the responsibility for every sexual encounter firmly on the shoulders of young men. They mention nothing about the women's role in in knowing their mind, in knowing whether they want to say yes or no, and in conveying that message clearly. And in my little video, I liken it to a gardening show where the woman is totally inert. She's like a pot plant. And here you've got the gardeners being instructed to put their fingers into the soil and see if it's still damp. Look at the leaves to see if they're dropping off. And she says, no, she does nothing. It's just the most extraordinary thing. I, many years ago, 20 years ago, was asked, to the horror of the friends of the ABC, I was asked to be a guest producer on Four Corners and make a program around this whole issue of sexual consent. And the feminists at the time were running a big no always means no campaign. And I went out to prove it wasn't as simple as that. And it was fascinating. I had no problem getting women who would talk about the fact that they didn't convey no clearly. They deliberately got totally pissed so that they could get carried away and not have to make a decision about whether they wanted to go to bed with a man on a particular occasion. It was much easier to just let things happen. Or they talked about playing games and saying no initially, wanting him to push through that resistance, wanting him to seduce them. I mean, the notion that that doesn't happen is just ridiculous. How many of you must all know about the classic chick lit, the sort of sexy bodice rippers that they call them. No, that they're called bodice rippers. They're one of the major themes in these erotic novels that are sold by millions and millions to women across the world is the woman saying no, 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 and the man, sort of seduces us and breaks down our resistance. That has always been out there as part of female culture, female sexual interaction with men, and I had no problem putting women showing women in this program who talked about that. And that's really tough. To pretend that women always say yes or no clearly is a total lie, and it really sets up males to be very vulnerable. Not only are men being told that they have to get this enthusiastic consent, the women are being told that they can change their minds afterwards, or even halfway through. And the classic example of the halfway through problem is a poor man called Paul Ibbs, who's known in the media as the 30-second rapist. In 1987, he was having sex with a woman who was a friend of his wife, and his wife knew he was having sex with her in the house where the wife was. He's having sex with her, and just, pretty late in the proceedings, she suddenly says, no, 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 you have to stop. He went on for 30 seconds longer and ended up being convicted of rape and was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. That's why he's known as 30-second rapist. And he appealed, and then it turned out, this was all a setup, that the wife had deliberately got her friend to seduce him and to set this all up so that she could get him out and sent to jail, and she'd get the house. And those two women, amazingly, were convicted for perverting the cause of justice, and they served 7 months in jail, which is pretty rare. But of course, this guy, lost his business. He spent $1 million on legal fees, and it ruined his life, ruined his reputation. What's fascinating about those sexual consent courses was there's really good evidence that they absolutely don't work. There's a woman in Canada who's doing research on this called Charlene Sen. She published an article in the respected New England Journal of Medicine 2 years ago, where she said that these campuses, including our own, they're all using the same program, these programs have never been formally evaluated nor proved to be effective in reducing the incidence of sexual assault. She's involved in creating what she calls a resistance program, which teaches women to recognise dangerous situations and avoid them, or resist sexual coercion. And she claims that that sort of approach, which involves women as well as men, reduces the incidence of date rape by 50%. Now, the fascinating thing is she's a feminist, and she doesn't agree that we should talk about alcohol as a risky situation for women. She adopts the feminist position which says any intoxicated woman is incapable of giving consent. And of course, they never define what intoxicated is. Are we talking about a glass or 3 glasses or whatever? But that is the assumption in all the courses and in the whole feminist position. On the night the Human Rights Commission released their data, there were 2 women featured, alleged rape victims, who both acknowledged they were so drunk when these incidents happened that they could hardly walk. They went back to his room, whatever it was. And of course, not a word from the person interviewing them about that issue of their responsibility to get involved in a situation where they're incapable of making consent. and they're giving consent. I've talked to some drug and alcohol experts who tell me there's clear evidence from overseas of the link between drug and alcohol abuse or heavy usage of drug and alcohol and sexual assault. If we wanted to do anything about sexual assault on our campuses, we'd be targeting heavy drinking. And yet, of course, the experts here aren't even allowed to talk about that, let alone do research on it. Last year, the University of Canberra had this party safe page on their website, which said things like, when you're drunk or using drugs, you're more likely to do things that you wouldn't do if you were sober. And of course the feminists took that up, persuaded the university to take it down, because they said you're not allowed to talk about don't get raped. You're only allowed to talk about don't rape. And so they removed that advice from their party safe page. I think it's so weird that we encourage women's responsibility in so many, in almost any other aspect of life that I can think about. You think about women who get drunk and get behind the wheel of a car and kill a pedestrian. She's expected to be responsible for that. She's culpable for that action. And where's the logic in not regarding women as in any way responsible if they get drunk and make stupid decisions, exposing themselves to sexual harm? Now, I'm not victim blaming. Of course the man must be held responsible if he deliberately takes advantage of a drunk woman. But we don't hold back from talking about risky behaviour when it comes to other crimes. I mean, if a man leaves his Porsche unlocked in the middle of Redfern, judge wouldn't hesitate to say, well, that was pretty stupid, even though he might convict the person who robbed him, Lots of other areas we talk about stupid behaviour. But now we're not allowed to ever say anything about the woman's responsibility in that sort of area. I mean, I've been following for years the occasionally you'll have an exploding judge, a judge who can't stand it anymore. There was one in Britain last year, a woman who said, she commented on a woman who got totally obliterated with alcohol, half dressed, goes to a nightclub in the middle of the night and ends up being sexually assaulted. And she dared to suggest it wasn't a very sensible thing to have done. And of course she was ripped apart. But the judges have been absolutely muzzled on talking about women's responsibility in any of this. So my essential argument is that universities are becoming increasingly unsafe places, not for young women, but for young men who risk being falsely accused. And they can be accused by women who are suffering from regret sex, or women who are feeling bad because they had ended up having sex with the wrong person, or annoyed that he didn't want to take it any further. She thought it was the start of something wonderful and it turned out to be just sex, or embarrassed because they were too drunk to know what they were doing. Back in the 19th century, the suffragettes had a slogan, votes for women, chastity for men. And this was very much about the fact that there has been a deliberate part of the feminist campaign for centuries now, which is about demonising male sexuality, about reining in any sign of normal, lusty sexual drive in men. And we've seen decades now in second wave feminism of them calling out men's appalling sexual behaviour. It was Pornography magazine, or it was Miss America contests, or you name it. Men are always in trouble over sex, in trouble for looking at women the wrong way, in trouble for looking at pornography or not keeping their trousers zipped or whatever it is. But now the major targets are young men, particularly in our universities. And, one of the interesting things after the Human Rights Commission proved such a fizzer was you watch them, they shifted their attention to the colleges. At my City Uni protest the other day, there was a big banner saying, close down the colleges. And am I all right for time? 1 minute. Oh, I have to anyway, so that's the big campaign now, to say that colleges are crawling with rapists. They've stopped talking about sexual assault, they're talking about sexual violence, and they're representing our colleges as full of unsavoury men doing horrible things. Now, I'm not saying that, male students can be really stupid. They put appalling things up on Facebook, they get involved in some really offensive behaviour, and we absolutely should call them out for that. But I think it's really important that we recognise that one of the issues that's happening here is there is a small group of activists who are, in my view, have a very puritanical idea about male sexuality, and there's a very big target on young men's heads. And we have to all get involved in standing up for men, standing up for your sons, your future sons, before the feminists take this further. And I think it's a really worrying trend in our society, the fact that the university students are being targeted. Thanks very much.